Welcome into the Husker247 podcast. The trio is back again just before Michael Brunson and Brian Christopherson embark on yet another exciting journey to Indianapolis for Big Ten Media Days. Let's just jump right into all things Media Days. Are you guys going to go to the famous steakhouse and get the shrimp cocktail and talk about it like the rest of the sports writing community?
Brian and I have never gone together. They do sell that cocktail sauce at Costco, so I feel like that kind of negates the
Necessity
need to
of
go
it.
there.
Yeah.
Although it's like a white glove place, right? Like they got the old
the
school
waiters
waiter.
wear suits, I believe. So you're kind of missing out on that.
Okay.
But I could you could get it at Costco, and I could come over in a tux and walk it from the fridge to you if you'd like.
That would be great. Yeah,
I like that. I like that idea. Can we get that on video?
Yeah, we'll do a guest quick hit thing of Brian in the white gloves, and he'll do a little like soft shoe dance too.
Yeah,
gloves.
Real quickly, we got a tweet about this. I don't know if you guys saw it, responded to it, ignored it, whatever. But should we pick a home game in which we all wear sweater vests? Is this a thing? Can we bring it back from when BC wore his? That felt like an older photo. That was like a 2018, maybe 2019, somewhere in there.
I just got rid of all my sweater vests. I do have I have some golf vests though that I could wear. That would work.
What about a fishing vest? Are you a guy that when you fish, do you have the fishing vest?
No, I've always been. I feel like you have to be someone who's like trout fishing or something. Like you're actually getting the water with the pants and all that stuff. I've always been in a boat, drinking a coffee with like my feet up on the side of the boat, very casual.
Okay,
like listening to a sports podcast. It's not
that sounds nice and pleasant, really.
Yeah, it is. It's not quite like a river runs through it, but that's how I fish.
Brunch, you got any vests? Are you gonna? So it sounds like we're a no on everyone wearing a vest for a home game. One listener is going to be upset about this. I think
that picture, Brian looks full of positivity about the direction of the program in that sweater vest. So it had to have been sometime early 2018 if we're guessing on time frame. But I could probably cut the sleeves off of a sweater that I have and just do like the Rick Vaughn sweater vest.
Yeah. Would you tailor your hair in a similar fashion?
I could. I may, now that I think
would
about
you?
It.
Yeah, you may. Yeah. You've already got the glasses.
That's
you could
true.
just get the skull and crossbones put right there. I mean, honestly, if you've never gone as Rick Vaughn for Halloween, you've really missed out here, Brunts.
People wouldn't understand. They'd be like, "What are you dressed up now? Like, what? This is what you look like all the time." I feel like a banker.
Yeah, very much. The tie and the sleeveless. Yeah, that's exactly what you look like. All right, let's dive into Big Ten Media Days. Remind me, who is representing Nebraska in 2024? BC.
Isaac Gifford, Ben Scott, Ty Robinson. Am I right, Bruns?
That's the trio.
I don't know that there's a big surprise in there. I mean, sometimes you get someone. Remember the year I think it was Corey Cooper got sent, and that was a surprise a little bit. But for the most part, Nebraska sends the people that you would anticipate that they would, and this feels like a group that represents Nebraska fairly well and represents them in kind of the important aspects of it. Anyone that you were surprised that didn't get included or was included, Brunts?
No, not really. I mean, it's tough because it's such like it's like a 6th year and 5th year heavy roster.
Yeah.
That like, I mean, I could have seen Nash going, with the various storylines that he has. I mean, I don't know. I'm always kind of curious, like if Nebraska is even going to register as like a major storyline in some ways at this thing. Like that's what I always kind of am curious to see is like how much and maybe that's like a lousy barometer to look at it through, but like how much does like national media like care about Nebraska, and how much are they wandering over to the table? At least like with the guys they're bringing. I mean, there's like in the case of Gifford and Robinson, I mean, they've kind of been through the lowest of the lows during their careers, and we talk about that and maybe the change of the program. Ben Scott, I think I enjoy talking to him because he's kind of an interesting guy, but I mean, I think he's probably more of a linchpin on the offense than what people are willing to admit. So it makes sense who they invited.
Do you have the question ready to go and asking Ben Scott how he feels about his horrible rating in NCAA football 25? Probably the most underrated player on a Nebraska perspective in that game. I think he's only a 78 as a senior, 5 year player, like multi-year starter, will be a multi-year starter at Nebraska, was already a multi-year starter at Arizona State, played multiple positions on the offensive line, and EA Sports basically they don't have a lot of faith in Ben Scott. I would like one of you to bring that up and see what the response is.
Wasn't Ty rated pretty low too?
Ty's a 79, yeah.
Yeah, that could be a theme. We could. I mean,
That's a really easy story. You can just send me the audio.
We're gonna need something.
There's going to be a strong chance that you're going to get somebody walking around to every table, butting in at random points, asking about college football ratings. It's going to happen. Like I knew when the game came out, I'm like, we're going to get somebody that's going to come butt in the middle of a question and asking somebody what they think about this rating. It's going to happen.
I mean, if the Big Ten wasn't the stuffiest, most boring conference in America, they would allow these players to have a small tournament to determine which one of them representing their teams would be the best player crowned. But I don't even anticipate anyone over there has thought about doing something that would tie what is the most popular thing going on in college football and video games right now with their Big Ten media days. But if you're listening, there's a free idea for you. Brunch, you mentioned this about Nebraska. The only way that I see people, national media coming over is if they want to write is this the year Nebraska wakes up and returns to being a player in college football, or the look out for Nebraska, they're a potential dark horse. I think you're going to get a couple of those columns coming out of Wednesday's appearance.
Nebraska, I think, is officially in dark horse territory. Like,
I mean, they've kind of been in dark horse territory for 7 years.
Yeah, but I feel like this year, though, you have like the added juice of like what Matt Rhule's done everywhere. Like, and I think when you kind of dig into what Nebraska was last year too, you can like, I mean, you see the record and it is what it is, but like Nebraska was a far better team than what they were record-wise last year, and completely blew off their toes in November. So, but I don't know. I mean, like I think this time of year, and especially like in an 18-team conference, everybody's looking at like, oh, who's going to kind of rise from the middle pack of teams to get, potentially challenge or get on the bubble of the college football playoff conversation. And I think Nebraska, for whatever reason, whether it's true or not, is at least among those teams. I don't know who else you would say is kind of from like that 8 to 12 type range would also fall into that category.
I think Rhule's also one of the better quotes among coaches out there. So for any national guys who have a certain, whatever their theme may be, he's a guy that you're going to wander over to because he's going to give you a good soundbite for the most part. And I've thought since he got here, if Nebraska does ascend and is like knocking on the door of the college football playoff, I feel like Rhule's going to become one of the spokespeople actually, like within
college football coach emeritus type thing. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I feel like he's going to be one of those like big coaches who has those opinions that sort of matter and stuff. So we might get a little taste of that. I don't know who's there on Wednesday with Nebraska that day, Bruns.
It's USC, UCLA, Iowa, Nebraska, and then I forget who the other two are, but
Feels like it should be a good spot for Indiana or Maryland to slide in there and be ignored like usual.
Yeah, Mike Loxley telling a great anecdote and then just kind of not going anywhere with it.
Was Loxley the one last year where he didn't get asked a single question at the podium?
He told a really lengthy story about when he was on vacation and Brian, remember that one?
Yeah.
About how he was on vacation and saw how hard this guy was working in it was like a gift shop or something like that at the airport. And like that became like a theme for him. It took a while for him to land the helicopter on the story, but
Brunson and I laugh about it because he started it and it seemed like it might be a great story. Like it felt like for like 20 seconds, like this could really, sat up, stopped typing. And then it just wasn't what we hoped.
Like we sat 10 minutes with that.
Okay. I think part of it with UCLA and USC will take some of it away from Nebraska. I would imagine USC specifically. I would imagine there's just going to be a lot of Lincoln Riley talk. A lot of, is he the guy? Can he make this work? Can they fix their defense overnight? How are they going to transition to the Big Ten? And then UCLA is similar, but as it often is, just lesser compared to USC. Iowa, I feel like Nebraska is going to be in that kind of Iowa territory where, you're there. There might be some interest. But I also think media days have changed. Like team coverage is so hyper-focused on everything with your team, and people are a little less interested in learning about everything else going on in Big Ten media days if it isn't explicitly about the team that they follow.
I learned this when I was back at the paper. So last time I did it, Dan Hawkins was still the coach at Colorado. This was back way back when. And I went and did a big story on Dan Hawkins and like how, what's going on there with Colorado. And then I saw the hits, like how many people actually read this story. And it's like a fraction of what you would get if you had, Matt Rhule talking about Justin Evans' progress, like that. So you're very right. It's all about your team, which also makes it kind of funny that we travel. I'm not complaining here, but it is funny that we travel all the way to Indianapolis to do what we basically did a month ago, which also takes a little bit away from this, wouldn't you say, compared to past years, because Rhule actually does do media availability throughout the offseason, at different times, way more than we've had in the past, which is much appreciated. But we just talked to him a month ago, and I don't know how much has changed since then. Not a lot, probably. He can talk about like the roster limits more maybe and like where that seems to be headed. But,
new defensive backs coach.
That'll be the big one. That'll be the big one.
Yeah, there'll be a lot of conversation about that.
That's the one headline we got that helps us out here.
Yeah. From the players specifically, what are you hoping to kind of get from someone like Isaac Gifford, Brunts, when you're in the conversation or when he's at the podium? Like what are you looking to learn? Obviously, he falls in that category where John Butler is now going to be his assistant coach versus Evan Cooper. But Gifford was one of the breakout guys for Nebraska last year. What are you curious about with someone like him as he enters the 2024 season?
Yeah, I mean, it's what's the next step for Nebraska's defense? Like, is it just getting back to where they were last year? I mean, it feels to me like, with everybody essentially being back for the most part, I mean, you got to replace some guys in the middle of the linebacker core and some safeties, but Quentin Newsom too, I guess. But I think it's fair to expect with as much continuity as they've had that things will continue on an upward trend. And what does that look like to them? Is it turnovers? Is it, how do they get better? Because if they can get just a little bit better, I mean, I think, that takes a lot of pressure off of an offense that, while veteran at certain spots, is still going to, potentially be starting a freshman quarterback. Running backs are a little bit, up in the air about who's going to emerge there. So that's probably what I'm more intrigued by there. The secondary actually, I mean, we'll probably talk about this during fall camp, but there's some intrigue there about what the heck that starting group is going to look like. Because I think there's at least a big enough question mark at that corner spot opposite Tommy Hill that it bears watching who emerges there, because I think you have guys that could do it, but whoever you slide in there there's going to be question marks about. So that's probably of interest to me, I think, is just kind of what that next step is for the defense.
BT, do you think it's going to be similar for someone like Ty Robinson, where we've been around the program for so long, we know a lot about him at this point? It's what happens next with Nebraska's defense is probably the biggest takeaway is what you're hoping. And it's not like he knows. He doesn't have a crystal ball, but he can tell you the work that they've been doing to get there.
Yeah, and the other part of it is sometimes at this event, so the player is off to the side and is at his own little podium. For people who don't know how it goes, for like, what is it, 45 minutes or so? And so they're kind of on the media's turf too, because it's called media days. So I think they kind of want to usually give you something, like guys who are there. They're maybe a little more, they'll chatter a little bit more than they normally would. But I feel like with guys like Giff and Robinson, you can maybe go more in depth than our 8-minute interviews sometimes allow in the spring, to maybe go back to, I believe that they truly believe in Matt Rhule and the staff. Like, I think there is definitely a drumbeat over there of like, I see where this is going. I know it's going to succeed and I want to be a part of it. I don't think that's a false narrative, but I would like maybe in the 45 minutes or whatever you get with players, you can get more in depth in that than we actually have, despite the fact that we've interviewed them a couple times here and there, because it's more of a space for that long form discussion that sometimes reveals interesting stories, or a guy will tell you something like he was on the fence about coming back and this is what changed my mind. I mean, sometimes stuff like that pops out, which is an interesting nugget. So hopefully some of that emerges because you just have more time to talk to the guys.
All three of these guys ended up in our most indispensable, looks like top 5. Nope, top 6. Ty Robinson was 6. Gifford came in 67, which was good for number 2, besting out Ben Scott at number 3 at 66, and Ty Robinson 57 cumulative points. He was number 6 behind Bryce Benhart, Tommy Hill, and then Nash Hutmaker was our number 1. We don't spend a lot of time on this, but Brian, I mean, you tabulate this every year. Were you at all surprised at how the top group shook out? I know there was a lot of conversation about why Dylan Raiola is only at number 8. But Nebraska's got a lot of, and Jamari Butler separates Ty Robinson and Raiola. Nebraska got a lot of veteran guys that are important pieces. They need to be healthy and they need to be effective for this team to take a big jump.
Yeah, first off, I understand what anybody who would say I would have had Raiola 1 or 2. I can get that argument. But I think there's 2 major themes that come out even in our list. Yes, Raiola and the QB play being improved is a big part of it. But to help Raiola in that offense, I think sometimes we're taking for granted this offseason the idea that Nebraska is just going to go have a top 10 defense just because. You actually have to go earn it again, and you have to have the special type of dudes who can make you earn it, and you shouldn't take them for granted when you're considering a list like this. So I think just as much as, yes, you want to see Raiola and the QBs, make that move this season, they need to have at their back a defense that makes it so Dylan Raiola doesn't have to be Superman this year. Like, the passing offense could go from 120th to 65th. And if you have a top 10 defense, you're still in pretty good shape. But you need guys like Nash and Jamari and Ty to make that happen. So I think there's a huge theme that shows up in our list about these super senior type guys, we could call them, who decided to make one more run at it because they believe in where it's going, and they're going to try to put their stamp on it and lay the foundation, basically put a trampoline for the program to jump off for the years ahead. So I think those guys on the top 7 you can make just as much a case as you could for Raiola. I don't have a problem with the debate. But I also feel pretty fine about the list with those guys up there, because that storyline matters just as much as the QB one.
Brunt's, you're up against it on the clock here. You've got things to do, places to be. Your thoughts on this list before you go?
Yeah, I think Brian summed it up pretty well. I mean, I think from the top of the list, I mean, I always kind of approach it of like, if this player went down, how in trouble would Nebraska be roster wise? I think if I had to do it over again, I probably would have a quarterback a little bit higher. And I completely get that debate, but I also think that there's certain guys that I think are just so far ahead of what's behind them on the depth chart that it needed to be represented. I mean, I think I don't know that Nebraska has another Nash Hutmaker on its roster right now. Certainly Ben Scott deserved to be higher up. I mean, I think Justin Evans is a fine backup center, but I think there's a big difference there and what they bring to the table, regardless of what EA Sports says. I think, there's the kind of the 15 to 24 was I had the most trouble with this year because there were a number of guys that were like 26th on my list that I very easily could have flipped out for other guys. And I think part of the difficulty there is that Nebraska just has a much deeper roster this year than what they've had in the past. And that's a good problem to have. But I think that, the kind of cornerstone of this group are going to be those, really seasoned veterans, the Bryce Benharts, the Isaac Giffords, the Hutmakers, Ty Robinson. Those are going to be the guys from a production point of view, a leadership point of view, are really, really kind of crucial to what this season is going to be. So there's a few things that a few guys I probably want back, a few rankings I want to have back, but I think overall we got some things done.
Yeah, I echo all of the sentiments that you guys have, and I think that we've even sort of talked about it. The difficulty for me after, you get into the top 10 and it felt like the 10 that I had there in whatever order were the 10 that should have been there, 11 through 25. It just felt like I had 30 names and people were going to get left off either because I wasn't thinking about them in a critical sense, or they just had to, because you can't rank that many of them. But I do think that speaks to kind of where the depth of the roster is. I think it also speaks to, and I think Brian had made this point previously, they're an old team. Like, this is a group of guys that have played a lot of football. There's a lot of steely veterans in there. There's a lot of guys that have experienced a lot of what college football has to offer, and they've come back for one more year. And this is why the 2024 season is so huge for Nebraska and what's in front of them. They have a roster where, the recent history doesn't give the expectation, but there's more talent than what the win and loss record has shown. This is their chance to prove that they're not those guys. And I think that they have that group. I think that there's a lot of potential, I don't want to say breakouts, but there's a lot of good players for Nebraska that are behind some of these veterans that are going to be pushing for some of their playing time. And I just think that makes everybody better. I think it speaks to why I feel so good about this 2024 season and why this exercise, if you actually read through it and you go through all these names, there's a lot of talent there. And I think Nebraska's got as good of a roster as they've had in a while to go take on some of these teams in the Big Ten and prove that it's time for them to kind of reassert themselves into the conversation.
To me, when you get to the top 10 too, it's almost sometimes interchangeable. Like Jamal Banks is 10th, and on a given day, you could say, well, I'd have him like 3rd or 4th. I'd be like, yeah, that sounds fine to me. Like I feel the same like about Rhule, with Bruns mentioned, like maybe it'd be if he were 2 or 3 spots higher, that'd be fine with me as well. That is the highest we've ever had a true freshman, which I just think it shows you how much belief there is in him, though, that's a case where people are like, there's not enough hype behind him in this particular list. Like usually it's like, oh yeah, let's wait and see what he does. But there is definitely a confidence in what he's going to get done from fans. And that's the fun part of this season, is that there is actually that's out there and it's in the air.
All right. You know what else is in the air? Commitments. And Nebraska keeps getting them in July. And that class that people were worried about in mid-June looks a heck of a lot better right now. So we will talk about the latest addition to Nebraska's 2025 recruiting class, next on the Husker247 podcast. All right. And I mentioned we were going to talk recruiting. It's just Brian Christopherson and I for this portion of the podcast. BC, a big addition that it kind of leaked out a little bit late towards the end of last week. And when I say leaked out, let me explain how this process has sort of worked with Cade Peterzak. Cade Peterzak does not do interviews. Cade Peterzak does not talk about his official visits. Cade Peterzak does not talk about his recruitment. Cade Peterzak did not allow really any info about how things were going. Cade Peterzak didn't confirm when he was taking visits. Cade Peterzak didn't confirm when he was going to be on campus at places. Cade Peterzak never really responded to messages. So how do you follow? How do you cover? How do you write about this recruitment? You have to talk to people within the program. You have to try to talk to the trainers that he works with or other people, and you have to try to gather whatever information you can. And for the longest time, it felt like Oklahoma was a team that was in the strongest position for this defensive lineman out of North Dakota. And so that was sort of the stock opinion that everybody had, because that was kind of the coaching staff that seemed to be most confident in what was going on. And Brian, in a lot of ways, different because Grant Brix gave interviews, but in a lot of ways, I had some callbacks to how Nebraska was able just to keep doing their thing, keep recruiting a guy, keep getting him to campus like they did with Grant Brix, and then ultimately overtook Oklahoma, became the favorite, got the commitment, and now he's in their class. And I just think the way that Nebraska has kind of done that now for several of these Midwest recruits, it's got to make you feel better about their ability to keep some of the top guys, right next door in Iowa or in the Dakotas or to Colorado or into Kansas, maybe someday back into Kansas City and into, we'll see if St. Louis can ever reflect that. But I just think that shows that they can go toe-to-toe with some of these really good recruiting programs and walk away with players if they want. Like Cade Peterzak is probably underrated by all of the recruiting services. And I know to feel like he's got the potential to be, more highly rated than he is right now. Oklahoma really wanted that guy. Kansas State really wanted that guy. Minnesota really wanted that guy. That's a big win for Nebraska in recruiting.
Yeah, I think so. This is a big one too for the recruitniks out there. Like, well, who'd you beat for him crowd? Because I think, as you were mentioning, the Oklahoma, K-State, definitely, Wisconsin was interested in him heavily. And it seems like he did do interviews after the fact. And by the way, I respect that. I mean, we obviously love when guys do interviews, don't get me wrong, but I understand that sometimes you're getting a lot of calls and you're just trying to keep your focus and like, I'll wait until I've decided to talk. But it seems like the whole coaching staff, not just, Coach Knighton on the D line, but Tony White as a strategist, he mentioned in his quote to Alan True, everybody over there, Corey Campbell, I think had a piece of this one where it just felt like it was a group commitment, or a group effort to land the commitment, I should say. So job well done. And you're right. Like, it's kind of over the last 2 to 3 weeks, whatever worries there were about how's this class going to fill out, it's those starting to kind of get swept under the rug.
Yeah, I think they've executed largely what they've wanted to do. There's been a couple of misfires in there, or some guys that maybe they felt like they had the opportunity to land that they didn't ultimately get in the boat at this point in time. But the season's still to come. I mean, one of the things that fascinates me, Brian, is that Nebraska's definitely kept tabs, and I'm not just talking Isaiah Mosey here. Nebraska's definitely kept tabs with guys that have committed elsewhere too. If they were to start off well in the 2024 season, it wouldn't shock me if come October with some of these games, you have some guys that are committed elsewhere that are taking an official visit to Nebraska or are showing more interest in what the Huskers are doing. I mean, they're sitting, I think, at 17 commitments right now. I don't know what the total number is going to be. I expected it to be around the low 20s. It's probably always higher than what my initial guess is, because I think Matt Rhule is going to push the envelope on his roster every single year. And he's not going to turn away talent. He's just going to figure out how to make it work. And so there's still more out there. There's obviously there's Christian Jones, there's Isaiah Mosey, there's Michael Terry the third, there's David Sanders, there's Will Hawthorne. Those are kind of the known names, but there are some other ones that Nebraska is definitely, going to work on too. And it'll be interesting how this all kind of plays out.
Yeah, and we were fired up last podcast about that Nebraska-Colorado game. I think of like a showcase like that. You're talking about early season success. And
I anticipate that recruiting list is going to be chock full of 2026s, 2027s. I think there's already some guys from Colorado that don't get recruited by Deion Sanders that are planning on coming out to visit for that game, assuming they get the invite from Nebraska. So I think there's a lot of fervor and a big recruiting atmosphere for that night too. Sorry, continue.
No, I mean, exactly. And then let's say the offense has a decent night, a decent to a beyond night. And Dylan Raiola looks pretty good. You mentioned like a Mosey as a receiver, and of course the connection with his dad now in the program that's already makes it interesting. But I mean, yeah, stuff like that. Like if they perform really well and they're 4-0 coming out of that Friday night game with Illinois, some guys who are like, man, there's some fire around Nebraska. It's maybe it's real, and so that's what this season is about. In some ways, from the recruiting side, it gives you the chance to sort of back up, like, we believe we're building this, and now we're going to show you that at least the first part of that building process is taking place, and so that's really critical.
Yeah, and we didn't really address this because nothing really was made of it. I have an idea as to what happened. I'm not going to say it on the show because I don't have that confirmed with the person directly involved. But there was a small period of time where there was a lot of panic over Terrence Knighton not being on the staff. I think we saw yet again just the value of Tony White and Terrence Knighton as recruiters. I mean, look at kind of the defensive line haul they've had over the last few years. And that even includes losing a guy like Carlin Jones, who they did a really nice job with previously. And in your 2025 class, you now add Cade Peterzak to Tyson Terry, who I think locally people are pretty excited about and might be getting a little slept on recruiting-wise. And then Malcolm Simpson, who didn't get to play as much as a junior and transferred schools and kind of feels like he's in a bad situation where maybe people wanted to use him as a safety option, where he loved the fact that Nebraska went to him right away and was like, no, you're a guy we have on our board. We want you. We don't want you if someone else doesn't come here. We want you to be here to take a spot away from someone else. And so that's a pretty intriguing defensive line crop right there. I mean, those are three of their better commitments in the 2025 class right now. They just keep stacking talent at an area that for a long time, it's kind of just felt like, okay, Nebraska's got a guy here. They got a guy there. What happens if they leave? What happens if they get hurt? Now you look at that defensive line room and you kind of forget about players like Brody Tagaloa that they back in the background. A guy like AJ Rollins, could he make a move? And because you spend all this time talking about RVP and different players, they have a really unique and deep defensive line group that when Nash and Ty move on, there's going to be an initial drop off, but it's not going to be as severe as it's maybe been in years past.
Yeah, that's true. Elijah Judy, by the way, I think there's real momentum behind him, and Su'a-Lafotu is another. And I think what's going to look good to those recruits is I do believe they're going to have a rotation that goes like 9 deep or so on that D line. And so they're going to see like, okay, maybe I'm not the main man right away. You wouldn't expect to be necessarily at a Big Ten program on the defensive line. But this is the type of program where if you do your stuff right, like Cameron Lenhart did, for example, even as a true freshman, Cam Lenhart was basically considered like the fourth guy. He still is right now. Like Cam Lenhart, listening to Knighton talk on the radio this past week, he's thought of like a starter in the same vein as Nash, Ty, and like Jamari. So, I mean, and he's a great example that they can put in front of recruits. Like, he did the work. He listened. He got after it. And look, we put him on the field right away. Not saying that's going to happen to you. There's no promises, but there's an example that it can, and we're going to play a lot of guys in this scheme. And so we've said this a lot, but all over the defense, that's an attractive part of Tony White's defense, is that like last year in the opener, they're playing 24 guys in the first half that are out there getting reps. Like, people look at that and they're like, I'm not going to get bored there. I'm not going to just be sitting over by the Gatorade bucket. They'll actually give me some snaps if I earn them.
Yeah, I mean, you get the opportunity to go out and play. That's what every recruit wants, right? Like, they, not everybody expects that they're going to be the starter, but they just want the opportunity to be able to contribute or to prove that they deserve more playing time. Brian, I didn't tell you that I was going to ask this, but I do want to ask you about a recent conversation that you were able to have with one of the biggest targets that Nebraska will have in the upcoming 2026 class. He's got a very unique connection to the state of Nebraska. He's been here several times. He really likes Donovan Raiola and what the offensive line has been doing. What can you tell us about Jackson Cantwell out of Nixa, Missouri?
That's correct. Jackson Cantwell, son of Christian Cantwell, and his mom, Terry, actually grew up in Crete. And they were, of course, they were both great throwers, like at an Olympic type level, world championship level. And one interesting thing about Jackson Cantwell, without giving away all the goods, is he's a thrower too, of course. And he'd like to do both sports in college. Like and so the philosophy that Matt Rhule has, that we've seen already at play with like Nash and Jalen Lloyd and Jeremiah Charles and these guys, I'm trying to think. I'm blanking on the baseball player's name who's coming in.
Connor Booth.
Yeah, Connor Booth. Sorry, Connor. I've talked to Connor multiple times. I just had a brain freeze. But all those examples, add them together, and so a guy like Jackson Cantwell looks at it like, oh, that's interesting. Like, not every place going to let me do that. He really seems like he wants to. And so, that's good for Nebraska. The fact that he's visited 3 times is as well. Slight family connection. I don't think that should be overplayed in this one. I don't think that's the big deal here. Incredibly smart dude. He scored like a 33 on his ACT at age 14, and I don't want to get into what my score was at age 17 or 18 in comparison.
If we added our scores together, I'm guessing we get over a 33, but it's not by as much as we'd want.
Not as much, no. And so he called me yesterday, and the British Open was sort of had just finished up, and I was kind of being lazy.
You're all keyed up. You big Xander Schauffele guy?
I'm happy for Xander. I mean, it felt like kind of a boring British Open, if I'm honest. But I enjoyed that he won it, but I was kind of sleepy because of it, actually, is what I was going to say. I wasn't keyed up. And so I didn't bring my best maybe in the interview, but even if I had brought my best, it's like, man, this 16, 17-year-old is, if you had to pick between the two, if we were candidates, you'd pick Jackson Cantwell over me for sure. So he's a sharp dude. He fits in line with those smart guys that this staff goes after. Of course, everybody wants Cantwell. But I think Nebraska's got a fighting shot here. His list is 14, and that's not something to make fun of. I know sometimes people put out a deal where they have like 25 schools, and it's like, okay, we get it. But I think he just wanted to, like, I got a lot of options. I can go anywhere in the country. I got to get it down to at least here. And then he's going to half that 14 probably down to 6 or 7 at some point. And I like Nebraska's chances to get down to that final group, just listening to him talk about it. And he talks about how Donovan Raiola coaches O-line in a unique way. And I've heard multiple guys speak on that.
Yes.
So that's interesting. Just like how recruits take that in, and I think they're intrigued by it at the least.
He was one of the first guys to really sort of key in on the offensive line does everything as a unit, and he noticed that. It might have been the spring game. Matt Rhule's first spring game in 23 was, I think, the first time I ever talked with Jackson Cantwell was after that. And he's just he's a bright kid, like you said. And he's a huge recruiting target for Nebraska football. So we'll see if they're able to get him to campus a couple times here in the 2024 season. And then the other thing is, You win, you get a little helium to you. It makes it that much easier. You've got all the other things are already sort of in your favor. Now you just need to show people that you're a program that actually wins football games. Like that's kind of where Nebraska, I think, is at. They have a lot going for them. It is very much time in 2024 to win football games, not just for the fan base's psyche or anything else, and not just so we aren't constantly having to grab the fire extinguisher to hose down the message boards after these games, but it would really give your program a huge lift if you can combine all the other stuff with the actual winning. I think it would really, really help Nebraska's recruiting efforts, both this cycle and future ones. Anything else you want to add, Brian, before we close out here today?
No, that should do it. Nebraska is 8th in the Big Ten media poll by Cleveland.com. That sound about right to you? 8th out of 18?
Yeah. I was saying, I got asked this question on a radio show earlier this morning. I was saying in my head, the highest of where I would expect them to be would be about 5 or 6, and that's if they're able to have that 9-3 type season. The two teams that are in front of them that I think that they are quite possibly better than and can prove that this year are Wisconsin and Iowa. Everybody else, I think they're pretty squarely behind. But I think 8th would be a great finish for them. I think 6th would be kind of 5th, 6th would be the best of which I could see for the upcoming year. But I don't think Nebraska is being slept on in terms of the potential of what they could be.
You know what's interesting to me is if you just narrowed it down, the discussion in Nebraska and Wisconsin. In this particular poll, Wisconsin is 7th, Nebraska 8th. But in a different magazines, Nebraska has actually been the one space ahead of Wisconsin. And a year and a half ago, or whenever it was that the hires were made at both programs, the initial media reaction trended toward, Fickle. Obviously, there was more attention to that, and just like, wow, look at Wisconsin got Fickle and all this stuff. And I feel like it was maybe got more fanfare than Rhule in Nebraska. In this new era of college football that we are entering, in my opinion, with the 12-team playoff, and it just feels like we're crossing over to a new road here. It's interesting to me that for all of what has happened the last decade plus, Schaefer, where Wisconsin has clearly been better and had the upper hand, it seems like they're in about the same starting point right now.
Well, heck, look at the last 2 games. They're not that far apart on the field. They're definitely not that far apart on the field. And Nebraska, frankly, gave both of those games away.
And so if you go and look at like commentary from that December when the hires were sort of happening right after 22, and now you look at how people are talking about each program, it's the same thing. I mean, people have, I think, slightly shifted like what their expectations are for Nebraska and maybe Wisconsin as well to a different degree. I'm not saying to sleep on Wisconsin or that Fickle's not going to be formidable. I think he could be. But I think the fight is they're weighing in on the scale pretty similarly right now, and I think a lot of people are seeing it that way.
Yeah, that'll be, as it usually is, an important and consequential game later in the season when those teams square off. Did you think? Do you agree though? Those are probably the 2 teams that if Nebraska were to finish higher, for you, could you see them getting much higher than 5th or 6th in this upcoming year?
Probably not.
In your wildest scenarios, can they get higher than that?
5th would be the best I could, everything kind of goes right, that I would put them. Iowa's 5th, and obviously we know the gap between Iowa and Nebraska is that it's that close.
Yeah.
So Iowa's 5th. I think USC was 6th. Another team like USC, most people would, in their initial reaction would be, oh, of course they're ahead of Nebraska, then they might prove that. But Nebraska will get their swing at them too in November. And so 5, 6, 7 on that list, Iowa, USC, Wisconsin are all on Nebraska's schedule this year. So is Rutgers at 9, by the way, who is a team that I think people understand is going to be a tough out when you play them. And that's going to be an important midseason game for Nebraska as well. So Nebraska sees all those teams that are right in the middle in those rankings on the schedule this year. And so they'll get a chance to prove it against the teams people have basically at the exact same spot going into August.
Not that we didn't already know it, but that first 3-game stretch of the Big Ten play before you hit the bye week, where it goes Illinois at home on the Friday, the Purdue on the road, and then you come back to Rutgers at home. That's a pretty critical stretch of your schedule. That's coming off of what you hope is a 3-0 start in the non-conference to kind of set things up. And those are all, really interesting games to piece those apart. I think Purdue's another one of those programs that I think they have the right hire in Ryan Walters. I think he's a really good coach. I think he's going to do some things recruiting wise for them. I think they're just going to be one of those kind of tough ass teams that you're going to feel it when you get done playing them. And so that's a pretty, it's a difficult stretch, not the hardest stretch of the schedule, but certainly one that we're going to learn a lot about Nebraska, I think, and what they really are through the end of that 3-game stretch.
That's a good point, because the best thing Nebraska did last year and didn't maybe get as much credit as it should have been given was that stretch in October where it was just sort of workmanlike.
Illinois, Northwestern, Purdue.
Northwestern ended up being a really nice win by the end of the year. Illinois ended up being it was kind of an ugly game, but it ended up being a better win than at the moment. Everybody was sort of reactionary to this. The offenses stumbling all over the place in the second half, but that was a solid W. And those are the games we had been begging for Nebraska to go get for a while, like at least get to the upper middle of the conference by winning those. And so they kind of did. And that's why you're seeing them like 8th in polls like this, because they proved that they could maybe be ahead of those teams a little bit. But now they got to back that up. You can't take a step back and just give them right back. And you can't take it for granted. For a long time around here, we used to talk about certain programs. I think Indiana basketball does this, by the way. They talk about like other teams like it's still 1991, and it's like, the fields change. Sometimes around here, we've done that with like Purdue.
I think it'd be a compliment for Nebraska basketball to be talked about like it was 1991, right? Like that was a really good team.
That was a bad year to pick. 1989. But
you know better than I at that point.
No, there's certain anyway with football, Nebraska kind of we used to talk about certain teams. I think for too many years, like okay, they're off to the side of the road. You should handle them. And clearly it was not easy for Nebraska to handle them. So that was a good step that they actually did last year in October. But you're right, that 3-game stretch is it's going to be as big as those games in November or Colorado. I mean, it all matters when you put it together.
Right. And then you think about the sort of the matchups in that, like you're going to have Ryan Walters and his defense going against a freshman going on the road. I think that's Nebraska's first road game.
11 a.m. It's an 11 a.m. game.
Watch out for the sprinkler heads. Be careful out there on that field. That's been a bane of Nebraska's existence. And then Greg Schiano, one of the nice things for Dylan Raiola, by the time he gets to November, he's going to have kind of had the kitchen sink, I think, thrown at him by some various coaches in this conference. So he's going to be a little, this is again assuming he's a starter, which I think is fair, and assuming health, which is reasonable. He's going to have seen some things. He'll be a veteran by the time he gets to November. I think. I think that'd be a fair assessment of things.
Yeah, that's true. One last thing, and then we'll go.
Absolutely.
With the indispensable Huskers, I think part of it with Raiola too, obviously us having him a little lower just to start, is I actually feel like Harburg could come in, and if the other parts and those other guys that are near at the top of our list play really well, that someone like Harburg could come in and you could still win games. That's sort of how I was viewing it too. And I'm not saying couldn't be a drop off there, but I think some of it comes down to if you feel like Harburg has progressed as a passer and like what he brings to the table. And I maybe feel a little bit better about that than some people, I think. So
I'm with you. I definitely feel better about Harburg than I think the consensus does. And I think it's unfair to judge him solely off of last year in his first run of playing time in a tough spot without a great cast of surrounding help at all times too.
Yeah, so all that stuff kind of factored into where we put it, but that's what summer lists are for, to get people saying you're an idiot or no, maybe they're nicer and they're just like, yeah, you should rethink this. I need to rethink a lot of things. So I always take feedback I get and say, yeah, maybe they're right.
Yeah. Well, you can, so the next time someone says something, you're like, well, we did a better job than EA Sports did. Exactly. And they'll just have to be like, well, that's true. And then the conversation will shift probably. So that's a good way to get out of it if you need to, Brian. Just file that one away.
Okay, got it.
So, all right. Hopefully your dynasties are going well for everyone. That's been enjoyable to follow.
How are you doing?
I am rolling with Georgia State, and after getting blasted by FCS Southeast and really having a crisis of confidence and whether I should even be playing video games anymore after that moment, righted the ship, made a bowl game, and things are going okay in year 2. So, things have been fine on my end. The game is very difficult. I will say that. I have had to scratch and claw for everything that I have earned, which is kind of fun in a way. I feel like, I've had to earn it a little bit more rather than just immediately start going 10-2 and then like 12-0 with a Sun Belt team. Nobody needs that. I feel like there should be some progression, some fighting through things, but going well for me in that regard. All right. Nobody needed to hear that, but I'm glad that you did. Mm-hmm. We will have more Nebraska coverage. We'll have all the Big Ten Media Days coverage that you can find at Husker247.com. There'll be plenty of recruiting coverage as well. As BC talked about, there will be a Jackson Cantwell story you'll want to check out later here, we think, on Monday.
Yep.
And we'll have plenty of stuff for you on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And then guess what? Practices, they're coming. You're going to get your media updates. You're going to get your depth chart talks. You're going to get your post-practice recaps from the boys at Husker247. Brian, can you feel it?
Yeah, Henry
Latovsky
Nuggets are coming. All that stuff. Yeah.
This is what the people want. It's time to shift our focus to 2024 football season, and we are inching ever closer. And you can always get everything you need at Husker247.com.